Hello, and welcome to another of the occasional series of Rethinking History. What I'm going to be rethinking today is the question of consorts, royal consorts, and more specifically, of course, male consorts. The fact I'm doing it, of course, has been triggered, I was going to say, by the Queen's decision. It's put more subtly than that. The Queen's expressed wish that Camilla will become not Princess Consort, as had been said at the time of her marriage to very contentious marriage to Prince Charles, but that she shall become Queen Consort. And that, of course, then triggered the debate. Well, why do women become queen, but men who marry a British sovereign, a female sovereign, only become consort, or in the case of the Duke of Edinburgh, not even Prince Consort, just the Duke of Edinburgh? Interesting question. Sort of thing that you might expect somebody who is called or calls himself a royal historian to have something really interesting to say. Actually, one of our best known royal historians did venture on this subject, Hugo Vickers, and he uttered the following astonishing platitude. Well, I suppose that's just how it is, he said. Just how it is. I suppose it really brings home the fact that there's sometimes when you put a specifying adjective in front of a noun, like, for example, another example, social in front of justice. Social justice isn't justice, it's injustice. In other words, the adjective cancels the noun. Very appropriate turn of phrase in that case. Similarly, I would say too often putting royal in front of historian cancels the historian. The adjective cancels the noun. The royal historian, I suppose as in the case of Mr. Vickers, is deeply expert in royal trivia, but doesn't actually understand very much of royal history. Well, there we are, that's a vendetta going. But let's actually have a look at the point of substance. Because in fact, the reason I've got so cross about this absolute refusal to see the wood for the trees is in fact the decision that the spouse of a female sovereign, and that's to say a queen regnant, shall not become a king, far from being just what it is, what we do in Britain, actually marks the fundamental transformation in the nature of the English, by this point it's actually the British monarchy, from a dynastic monarchy to a parliamentary monarchy and therefore a constitutional monarchy. It's not just how it is, it's that line of divide. It's like the division between BC and AD. And it falls, in this case, very precisely at the beginning of the 18th century with the succession in 1702 of Queen Anne. The fact that her husband, Prince George of Denmark, he'd been created Duke of Cumberland, actually Earl of Kendal as well, where I was born, and he remains just that. But of course, that hadn't always been the case. It's not just as it was. That was an innovation. It was a radical innovation. Let's go back and look at the other side of that divide, the BC world, right, very good, isn't it? The world before consorts, the world of kings, when the husband of a queen regnant would automatically become king. Let's go back. Of course, the very idea, again, it's really important that we say this, the very idea of a queen regnant itself is a novelty. If you look at English medieval history, there is no such thing. Everybody will say, of course, Matilda, the daughter of Henry I. Matilda is never queen. Instead, she's known as Lady of the English because the coronation, in those days, the necessary step, coronation and consecration, the necessary step to becoming a fully acknowledged monarch in Westminster Abbey, never took place for the very good reason that the London mob wouldn't have Matilda. She was too arrogant, she was too boastful, she was deeply unpopular. So coronation was impossible. As we all know, the attempt at making Matilda Queen Regnant, led to the terrible civil wars and the accession of King Stephen, and so on. And it was only in the person of her son, by her husband, Geoffrey, Count of Anjou, her son, who becomes known as Henry II, the first of the Plantagenets, that the old royal succession is restored. And of course, it is a new dynasty, isn't it? The Plantagenet dynasty, and the greatest and one of the most remarkable group of rulers that any country has ever had. So there is no Queen Regnant until, well, as usual, Henry VIII. It is Henry VIII who changes the rules. I mean, think of it even in the case of Henry VIII's father. Henry VIII's father, Henry VII, let's get it the right way around, Henry VII, when he succeeds in 1485, his mother, Lady Margaret Beaufort, is still alive, and Henry VII's only right in his own person to the succession comes through his mother. So if there'd been a possibility of female succession at that point, it should have been, we should have had Queen Margaret I of England, and because in fact Henry would have been at that point, presumably Henry, I don't know what, he's certainly Henry Earl of Richmond, maybe it'd have been Henry Prince of Wales, would never have succeeded because he predeceases by a few months his own mother. He dies in April and she dies in June 1509. So the reign of Henry VII shows, as late as the end of the 15th century, female succession as such is impossible. The English had long accommodated themselves to the idea of succession in the female line. They'd have to, because by the time that you've got to the 15th century, everybody effectively claims the throne through the female line. So you just have to acknowledge the fact. There was the possibility of an alternative set of rules, and of course the French, deliberately to exclude the possibility of a foreigner becoming king by marrying a queen regnant, and they had introduced the absolute rule that succession to the royal house could only go in the male line. It couldn't go in the female line, and a woman couldn't succeed. It's known as the Salic law. The English never introduced this. As I said, they couldn't have introduced the strict rule about female succession, but in practice they didn't have a female sovereign until Henry VIII, as he did in so many other areas. Henry VIII changes the rules. He, first of all, by his first wife, Catherine of Aragon, as we all know, has a single daughter, Mary. And from the moment of her birth in 1516 until his decision to marry Anne Boleyn on the 1st of January 1527, which I've talked about a lot elsewhere, and in that stretch of time, that 11 years, one of the central goals of Henry's policy is to enable Mary to succeed and to find a husband who will be strong enough to enable her claim to the throne to be vindicated. But of course, the first divorce, overcomes that, overthrows that, and Mary finds herself declared a bastard at the same time that her mother, Catherine of Aragon, is declared never to have been Henry's wife. She isn't actually divorced. It's what is technically known as a declaration of nullity. The marriage is actually nullified. And then, of course, Henry marries Anne Boleyn in the absolute confident expectation that there will be a son of the marriage when Anne falls pregnant and comes near her term in the late summer and early September of 1533. What happens? Well, you've actually prepared this magnificent christening at Greenwich. You even prepare the letters to be sent out announcing the birth of a prince. And then, of course, out pops Elizabeth I, the girl. And all those letters, some poor clerk has to stay up all night putting S's on the end of them, announcing the birth of a princess. Anyway, nevertheless, she too is acknowledged as heir to the throne for that brief period and at 1,000 days that her mother remains queen, and then the same process repeats itself. Anne is, well, just to be sure, to make sure she's executed as well as divorced, and Elizabeth too is bastardized, and then you get the succession of Jane Seymour, who produces the long-longed-for son, and in that very smart career move dies immediately afterwards so that nothing can go wrong, and she becomes the perfect wife, and there are no children by the remaining three wives. Henry then does this extraordinary piece of having your cake and eating it. Henry VIII, like Boris Johnson, is very much a cakeist. He believes in having cake and eating it. So he decides very sensibly that the life of a single male, obviously he expects, he desperately hopes that Edward will live to succeed him, but it's not strong enough to sustain the dynasty. So in all the succession acts which are passed from this point, you do what in some ways seems the common sense thing to do. You declare that Edward should succeed, then if he dies without heirs, well, actually Mary takes precedence over Elizabeth. She's the elder born, so she would succeed, and then if Mary dies without heirs, well, Elizabeth herself will succeed. It goes through with remarkably little, as far as I know, no dispute at all, and yet it marks a revolution, because although Henry and nobody else could fully have foreseen it, Edward does indeed die without heirs. He, of course, of his heirs of his body. He does, of course, as we all know, he tries to change the succession, but in default of anybody else, he has to leave it to a woman as well, to Jane Grey. So we actually have the first Queen regnant, admittedly for only a few days. It's actually a woman, Jane Grey. She falls before Mary, asserting a claim of legitimacy, and you get the succession of Mary, who is the first person we would normally recognise, daughter of Catherine of Aragon, the first person we would normally recognise as Queen regnant of England. What happens? Well, it's striking, isn't it? I've talked about this in the video that I did on Mary herself. On the one hand, Mary has this absolute sublime Tudor confidence in herself, in her absolute unimpeachable dynastic right to succeed to the English throne. And of course, it's that confidence that gives her strength to fight against the entire political establishment. The imperial ambassador in England, the ambassador of the Emperor Charles I, Charles V, Charles I of Spain, Charles V of the Holy Roman Empire, took absolutely for granted that Jane Grey would succeed. After all, the council was behind her, the church was behind her, the dominant figure in the council, John Dudley, Duke of Northumberland, was a famous soldier. It seemed an absolute open and shut case. And yet Mary, with this astonishing act of courage, she draws on her forces from Framlingham, from the old headquarters of the Dukes of Norfolk, the Howards Dukes of Norfolk. She'd succeeded to their lands. She draws on that Catholic hinterland of East Anglia and that sense of legitimacy, and she summons an army. She marches against Northumberland, and Northumberland, it sees his troops vanish, and finally the infinite humiliation at Cambridge, he's got to throw his cap in the air and proclaim Mary as Queen too. But this astonishing confidence on the one hand, again the ability with which she sees off Wyatt's rebellion in the following January, in the January of 1554, her ability actually to stand up in front of the citizens of London, to go up to the hustings, the actual platform for which all candidates for office in the city in those days actually proclaimed why they should be elected, to get up there and to address the assembled citizens in Guildhall in that splendid, deep, powerful voice, and to persuade them to back her, despite the fact so many of them were Protestants and had much to lose. They do back her. All of that courage on the one hand goes with a deeply conventional attitude towards womanhood and the role of a man and a woman. Mary, although she knows she's the right to the throne, is very uneasy about the exercise of full kingship. There is the sense, it's actually written about by lawyers at the time, there's a sense that kingship is specifically male. I mean, when you think of it, it's the power of the sword. It can only be exercised by a man. Parliament eventually decides, well, they'd better do something about this, and an act is passed to affirm that a queen regnant actually has the powers of a king. But you can see Mary is deeply hesitant. She doesn't knight people. She gets somebody to do it. She gets a man to do it on her behalf. And ultimately, I think, the whole business of marrying Philip, the son of the man, son of Charles V, that she herself had been pledged to marry in the 1520s, when there's that lovely miniature of her as a girl wearing the big brooch which says Emperor, the son of the man that she might have married. Her determination to marry Philip is, of course, it's to do with a desire to reunite herself with her mother's family, a desire to have a powerful consort who will enable her to force through the restoration of Catholicism in England. It's all of that, but it's also a desire for a man, for a husband. Mary has I think, very much inherited from her mother, Catherine of Aragon. She has a wholly conventional view, despite the fact, like Catherine, she's a hugely powerful and forceful and well-educated person. She has a wholly conventional view of the relationship of a man and a woman. And so, when she marries Philip, Philip becomes king. Let's get this absolutely right. A new reign is declared. It is the reign of Philip and Mary. King Philip is king, not simply in name. He's king in fact. He is not called King Consort. He is never crowned, but he actually, whenever he is in England, and much of the time that he's outside England, he actually acts as king, and he takes undoubtedly the most active role in the determination of policy, the special committee of the council, which reports directly to him. This touches the central point, doesn't it? A queen regnant, by definition, is the heiress of a royal house, when all the males of the royal house in the direct line have died off. In other words, she is an heiress. If you have a dynastic view of kingship, direct dynastic view of monarchy, she is the heiress to the kingdom. And when she marries a man, well, we all know what happens to the possessions of an heiress. They pass to the husband, to the king, or at least they do potentially. This issue, of course, confronted. That was why, as I said, the French had actually outlawed female succession. Otherwise, their king would have been Edward III of England, which they very much do not want. And the English, of course, confront this fact very clearly in 1554 with the marriage of Mary and Philip, because of course the vast increase of the power of Habsburg, of the House of Habsburg, that's Philip's royal house, which had occurred from the end of the 15th century to the middle of the 16th, which had turned the Habsburgs from fringe, important but quite minor Dukes of Austria with this funny title occasionally of Holy Roman Emperor, turned them from these fringe princes into the effective masters of Western Europe. It was entirely due to marriage. It was that series of extraordinary lucks in marrying heiresses. The fact that Maximilian marries the daughter of the last Duke of Burgundy, the chap who is killed by the Swiss mercenaries, the daughter of Charles the Bold, marries Mary of Burgundy and inherits the extraordinarily rich territories of the Dukes of Burgundy. And the fact then that his son Philip goes and marries Joanna, the elder sister of Catherine of Aragon, and through her inherits the entire territories of Spain. That's to say, both he's heir to both Aragon and Castile, and to their vast territories in the New World, and so on and so on. This extraordinary accretion of territories by marriage. So the big question in 1554, with the marriage of Philip and Mary, was England going to become part of the Habsburg Empire? And the English were profoundly aware of this fact and deeply reluctant to contemplate the possibility. And the result is the negotiations are led by William Paget, certainly the cleverest member of what was actually a very distinguished Privy Council. And Paget leads the negotiations with the imperial representatives, and they come up with a remarkable treaty, a remarkable marriage treaty between Philip and Mary. And what that treaty does is to give Philip every right as what we would say a king consort, or as actually a king for his lifetime, for the period, for Mary's lifetime. In other words, his rights in England, although they are the rights, the proper rights of kingship, as I said, he takes precedence of Mary. The reign is retitled the reign of Philip and Mary, and its statutes are passed in his name. His head appears on the coinage and everything else. He has the right in the kingdom only so long as Mary lives, unless there are children. If there are children, in that case, the absorption of England into Habsburg Empire will happen, though there were attempts at defining which blocks of territories should go where to the heir of the marriage. But everything then depends on Mary having a child, and famously, of course, she doesn't. Which means that that first experiment in the, as it were, the transfer of sovereignty from a woman, Queen Regnant, to her husband, that experiment of the transfer of sovereignty aborts at that point. But of course, the precedent is still there. Once again, we get the succession of a female, a Queen Regnant Elizabeth I. Elizabeth is very different from Mary in, well, virtually everything, apart from the fact she's a Tudor and she's very bright and that she's a woman. But very different in her attitude towards the position of female monarchy. Elizabeth seems to have no doubts about it at all. She had no sense that she needed a man to complete her sovereignty. I think as a woman it's very clear. She desperately wants a man. She wants children. She has the ordinary appetites of, well, what used to be regarded as the ordinary appetites of womanhood. But she's got no doubt about the fullness, the completion, the naturalness of her sovereignty as a sole woman. And there is the famous phrase, I've no idea whether it is actually true or whether it's ben trovato, but Elizabeth is supposed to have said, here there will be but one mistress and no master, in that sense of absolute confidence. And all the marriage treaties that are drawn up with views to the various possible husbands, all of them model themselves on the treaty between Philip and Mary, because really the protections couldn't actually have been better than that. So we've got then the first two, if we set aside poor Jane Grey, we've got the first two Queens Regnant presenting rather very different pictures. One of them with a king, not even a king consort, a real king, but a king only for the lifetime of his wife in the case of childlessness. But of course he would have been a king for, as it were, for his own lifetime if he'd had an outlived Mary, if they'd had a child, but they don't. And then Elizabeth. The succession of the 17th century has great interest in terms of consorts, but in terms of female consorts, I'll do a separate talk on those, because what happens to them in the 17th century is fascinating. But by the time we've got to the end of the 17th century, once again, there is the double succession of two sisters, exactly like Mary and Elizabeth, except this time they are the daughters of James II, Duke of York, by his first wife, Anne Hyde, and they are the Princess Mary and the Princess Anne, and they come to the throne in the dramatic circumstances of the Revolution, because that's what it is, of 1688, when James II is driven from the throne, or the rather convenient rather convenient fiction that's used abandons the sovereignty, throwing the Great Seal into the Thames and fleeing across to France. What happens? Well, there's actually an interregnum. We forget this. There's a suspension of the formal suspension of the sovereignty between December 1688 and February 1689. Of course, there'd been an invasion. So James flees. Why does James flee? Well, actually because there had been an invasion. It's quite uncomfortable to think of it. But properly, I think, we should see 1688 as another conquest. A bit like the Norman conquest, except it's not, something as big as Normandy. Well, slightly humiliatingly, it's the Netherlands, because, of course, Mary, the elder daughter of James I, is married to her cousin, again on his mother's side, very much a member of the House of Stuart, the Dutch stadtholder of the head of the House of Orange, William of Orange, and William invades with a considerable army, with a siege train, with a printing press for propaganda, with preachers and the whole apparatus. Sounds a bit like Putin, doesn't it? The complete apparatus of both conquest and persuasion and propaganda. What does that mean then about what is William's status going to be in terms of hereditary succession, in terms of the rules clear from Henry VIII onwards that the eldest daughter of a king who has no male offspring shall succeed, that's to say Mary. Mary is Queen Regnant, and William of Orange, well, what doctrine? What is he? What shall he be? William is perfectly clear. He will be king. He makes it absolutely clear he will accept no other terms. But king in what capacity? Will he, like Philip, be king in right of his wife, and able to hold the throne if she predeceases him, only if they have children? Clearly, William is aware of that possibility, and he refuses it absolutely. Instead, the English are forced to concede a double reign. That's to say that William is king himself. Mary, by definition, is queen herself. So you have literally a double reign. You've got both. It's a real paradox. You have both a king regnant and you have a queen regnant. Except that Mary, again, this whole question of male-female relations, Mary, although she's an interesting and highly intelligent woman, she sees herself as essentially subordinate to her husband. She makes little intervention in politics. She remains a very, very powerful symbol of Englishness, of dynastic continuity and everything else. But although she's their thrones are the same height. Their thrones are literally the same height, and they are crowned equally. Neither is crowned as a consort. They are crowned equally, but the real sovereignty is exercised by William. And when Mary dies, William remains king. She dies in 1698. William remains king for another 4 years until 1702, when he too dies. In other words, what we've got then is, I'm afraid, very much not what the English do. It's just as it is. We've got this repeated case that the husband of a queen regnant isn't consort, isn't even king consort. He is actual king. actual king with the Privy Council reporting to him, with the actual royal title being a double title, Philip and Mary or William and Mary, and with, of course, the man taking the precedence. And again, this is something that because we've got so used to female rule with both Victoria and then Elizabeth, the one dominating the 19th century, the other dominating the second half of the 20th and well into the 21st centuries, we forget that the term king carries the much greater weight. The notion of sexual equality is very much a product of the period after, in any meaningful sense of the word, after the First World War. So we have this very different precedent of the wife, the husband of a queen regnant as king, and actually exercising the sovereignty, with the only issue of debate being, did he exercise the sovereignty simply for the term of the life of his wife, or did he exercise it permanently for the whole of his own life? The Philip on the one hand being the one, William the other. Then that's it. We've come to the BC. We've come to the year before Consort. We are now into the year after Consort, because in 1702 the absolute opposite happens. Anne was already married. She was married to an agreeable, handsome, pleasant, rather ineffectual man called Prince George of Denmark. George, in 1689, when of course Anne at that point becomes heiress to the throne, as William and Mary don't have a child, Anne becomes heiress to the throne, and her husband, George, is given an English title, but it's just a dukedom. He's made, I mentioned it already, he's made Duke of Cumberland and Earl of Kendal. And nothing is done to promote him in 1702 when his wife becomes queen regnant. Why? Well, actually, it's pretty clear. Well, there's a whole bunch of reasons. Partly, George is singularly unassertive. He actually is perfectly happy to declare that he is a subject, the subject of his wife. He may be her husband, and he's clearly, in one sense, a pretty good one. They have loads and loads of kids, only one of whom lives briefly and dies prematurely. He's a good husband, but without political ambition. And so his relative stepping back is part of the story. And incidentally, when you next get this situation repeating itself under Victoria, Victoria views George of Denmark with absolute contempt. She knows that her Albert deserves much more, deserves formal public status, and she bends every rule to give it to him. Then Anne, like Victoria, I think would have been pretty keen on giving her husband much enhanced public status. She does give him nominal command of both the army and the navy. She even has discussions with John Churchill, Duke of Marlborough, serious discussions about could he be made king. Marlborough, Churchill advises her absolutely not to broach it to Parliament. I think what's happened is, well, several things have happened. There is this very different view, this now non-dynastic view of monarchy. The settlement of 1689 manifestly creates a parliamentary monarchy. Now, I know that one of the political parties the Whigs and the Tories, one of the parties that was party to that settlement of 1689, the Tory party, is desperate to preserve some sort of notion of a dynastic continuity, but the reality had actually been broken. There was now a parliamentary monarchy. The title to the throne depends upon an act of parliament, not a notion of a divinely ordained succession. And I think that's the really key issue. You've also seen the very rapid growth of a very powerful and assertive nobility, and the nobility which has managed the succession in 1689, that is coming to understand how to rule by managing parliament, and of course is also now seeing, admittedly very much guided by William III towards war with France, is seeing itself in command of the new machineries of the Bank of England, of the mounting force of the British Navy and of the British Army, is seeing itself commanding an instrument which, well, increasingly commands Europe and can challenge and can defeat the most powerful European power, that of France. I don't think they want a man imposed upon them in the right of his wife. And it doesn't happen. And it doesn't happen again when Victoria succeeds. Victoria is very different. She takes a much more assertive view about the role of Albert. And of course, Albert is a profoundly, we're talking from 1837, where Albert himself is a profoundly different person as opposed to the rather ineffectual, uxorious George of Denmark. Well, Albert is certainly very uxorious. I mean, he and Victoria, as we know now, have a passionate relationship. She adores him physically. He seems to adore her. They love sex. She adores sex. She doesn't like having children, though they do keep popping out. But Victoria, in terms of her relationship with Albert, although she is a powerful, in many ways highly eccentric personality, Albert very quickly establishes almost a stranglehold over her. He's got an immensely powerful will, a formal, regimented mind, and Victoria submits. She submits to it. And Albert's passion for rulership, his sense of activism, his sense of activism in government, in social policy, in aesthetic policy, thanks to Victoria's backing for him, thanks to her passionate assertion of his status, her insistence on the formal granting of the title of Prince Consort and all the rest of it, Albert, well, he doesn't become king, but arguably becomes something even more important. By the time you've got to the 1850s, Albert effectively is Prime Minister for life. His role in policy, virtually every form of policy, is overwhelming. You can see it in everything from the decoration and indeed the very structure of the rebuilt Houses of Parliament, the rebuilt Palace of Westminster, which it's he very much who makes sure that we call it the Houses of Parliament because that's what we think it is. It is Albert who makes sure that it remains a genuine royal palace, with the royal aspect of the building vastly prominent. And he sees, in other words, the genuine government of England as crown in Parliament. And he doesn't actually wear the crown, but he manipulates the person who does. So Albert's enormous influence in terms of the design, the decoration of that building, his extraordinary role in the Great Exhibition, the reformation of British cultural life that follows that, in everything from foreign policy, relations with America, the avoidance in the run-up towards the American Civil War, of British involvement and so on. Albert's finger is everywhere. If Albert had lived, I think the Rethinking the Consort would have a different end. As it was, when Elizabeth succeeds, the poor old Duke of Edinburgh isn't even made Prince Consort. They follow instead the precedent of George of Denmark. He remains, is made, lives and dies a mere royal duke. But it is now clear, in the year or so that's elapsed since his death, we can now see the extent to which the Queen in private concedes so much of the management of the monarchy and particularly of her family to him. But, to repeat, the history of the king or the consort The history of what does the husband of a queen regnant become isn't just what we Brits do. It represents that fundamental dividing line between two different kinds of monarchy and two different kinds of state. The dynastic, where the husband of a queen regnant not only becomes king, he takes the kingdom to one where he is a consort and an add-on, because it's a parliamentary constitutional monarchy. That's real history, not royal history. Hello, and thank you for watching David Starkey Talks. If, as I very much hope, you're enjoying them, why not become more actively involved and join my members club? As a member, you'll be able to take part in the members-only weekly question and answer session, suggest topics for forthcoming videos, and have priority booking for my forthcoming live events. And while you're at it, why not have a look at the store page on my website, davidstarkey.com. There you can purchase t-shirts and other merchandise, buy signed copies of my books, and, if you're feeling brave and a bit flush, even arrange to take me out to lunch. Thank you once again for watching. I look forward to hearing from you and to welcoming you to my members club.